Thank you so much for joining me today for a very exciting topic, and that is the role of CISO in building trust. And let me quickly start by introducing myself. And I have a bit of a spoiler alert. I'm not a CISO, but I do work with our security team very closely. We have integrated privacy and security management system, and I oversee the privacy part of it, including our security certifications under ISO as well as SOC 2. So I'm very happy to talk to you today. I'm part of ONETRUST, which is a trust intelligence platform which will help you automate some of the things we're talking here about, especially as it relates to risk management. So let's take a look at trust. I guess you probably have seen this one before, right? So definitely trust is one of the things that we hear a lot about, especially when we don't have it or when we lose it. And in here, I think we are first to set by figuring out, okay, how do we define trust for us as a business? Because if we are supposed to implement trust and become trusted businesses, then we probably should have a common understanding of what trust actually means for our business. And to give you an idea for where I see the connection between the CISO and the security roles in the company and the idea of trust as something very lofty, you can see all of these examples showing that you lose trust if you don't do the security job properly. Perfect examples are companies involved in data breaches not responding properly to those data breaches. That's where businesses lose trust. Also, on the flip side, the CISO role can be actually quite instrumental towards building trust. If you have a very good security posture as a company, if you can showcase to your vendors that you're doing things in a transparent manner, then by a flip side, you're earning trust. So security has a very important role in this big discussion. So as I mentioned, a couple of examples eroding trust. We have security-related ones as well as others. A lot of these would involve fines. A lot of these would involve bad press. So this just goes to reiterate that security teams have a very, very important role to play, not just in preventing breaches, security breaches and incidents, because we all know that it's not always possible to prevent all of them, but also in the way how we shape communication about these security events and how we prepare the company posture for any security-related debate and how we manage risks, security risks that also have overlaps into trust as a topic. And I'll talk to it a little bit in just a moment. So I think, as I mentioned earlier, one of the key parts in building trust into your business is understanding what are we actually talking about when we say trust. And if you ask many organizations, you'll probably get many definitions for trust. So I'll add one more. And this is our definition of trust. And as you can see, it basically says that trust is a collection of integrity-based commitments and actions that are continuously measured, they are tested, and they are enforced through consistent behavior. Does it look familiar to you? Because I would challenge you to say that you have seen these before. This is very similar to definition of a control, risk control. And there is a good reason behind why we see trust defined through the controls. Because if you approach trust as an objective, you can actually break it down into operational steps of identifying risks, which are risks to your trust objectives, and also identifying controls that you implement to mitigate for those trust-based risks. So our proposal is, if you're thinking about trust for your business, to start taking it on operationally, and to start thinking about it as a control for the risks that your business is facing. Now, one of the things that probably come quite naturally, but I wanted to point out, is that we have quite a few people who are involved in the discussion of trust, both internally within your company, as well as externally. So all of these people are either benefiting from trust or are impacted by building it for you, for your business. So customers would be one of the key, I guess, adjudicators of whether you have trust as a business or not. Likewise, your business units would be, and employees would be the people on the ground who make or break the trust for the business. And if you look at trust within the business as such, one element which is really critical to point out is that trust is very much cross-functional. So you have people in privacy like myself talking about trust and thinking about privacy by design and privacy impact assessments. You have CISOs, you have chief finance officers, you have marketing people talking about trust, customer relationship team talking about trust. And everyone has their own agenda in why they're talking about trust. And if you are to embrace the idea of tracking trust objective from your perspective as a CISO, you have to talk to all of these people and understand what their objectives are, so you can actually cover them as objectives that are measurable, have metrics around them, and have those controls for those risks which relate to them. So in case you're not, hearing it yet, yes, it's hard. It's hard because it means that we have to make sure that we're talking to all of these people. So the message here is, if you're building trust, you're bound to talk to a lot of people, and yes, it can be a little bit hard. So why are we actually doing it if it's hard and, we have a lot of other stuff to do? Well, the thing is that there are actually quite a few benefits that come out of it for us. I think a few of them are probably quite obvious. Firstly, you can definitely use trust as a competitive advantage. And actually, I would argue that some businesses have already gone down that path quite a lot. If you've seen some of the recent advertisements by Apple, for example, they're really drilling into the idea that, yes, you can trust us with your data. We will not betray your trust. That is very strong messaging, and it can also translate itself into making it easier for you as a business to attract more investors, because investors in general are more drawn to businesses which build upon the trust framework. For them, it's not a notion of being romantic and being idealistic, but it has proven to them that businesses which are built around trust frameworks typically experience less impactful incidents, which again translate into less harm to their share value. So for them, it's a very cold-hearted calculation that they would rather invest into a business that is thinking along the lines of trust framework, as opposed to business which is thinking about privacy, security, ethics, more in silos. Another element that is probably one of the benefits for why it's worth doing the work for trust is the idea that, as I mentioned, it can also help you simplify compliance. In a perfect world, you will not be thinking about trust and only thinking about privacy by design, or only thinking about risk management for your vendors. You'll be really thinking about it holistically. So the business units, the people who are working on the ground for security teams, as well as ethics, as well as privacy, will be probably looking holistically at, for example, the new vendor that you're onboarding. And they will be assessing those vendors in the same time, which translates into a business benefit because it cuts down on the procurement time. And they'll also cut down on the duplicity in asking very, very similar questions because they're relevant for all of the teams. One more item that is arguably one of the biggest benefits is regarding the rapid digital transformation that the trust can help with. I appreciate that digital transformation sounds like an 80s movie where the Transformers suddenly transform and they're no longer cars, they're robots. I think the key differentiator here is that digital transformation doesn't have an end date. If your business undertakes digital transformation, and I think most of us have to one way or another, it means that we're evolving digitally. So there is further and further steps that you need to take to make sure that you as a business know how to navigate a data-driven industry, that you also know what you're doing with the data, that the data is secure, that it's flowing to the right people, that the vendors you're leveraging for that data management are ethical vendors. All of these things speak to data digital evolution. And the businesses that build trust into the frameworks as their objectives are usually easier in, I guess they find it easier in adapting in this digital world. And final point, it actually helps you to recruit talent because surprisingly or not, people are more likely to work for companies that take seriously some of the key issues that resonate with them and their values. So if you are one of the people on the market, you're probably less likely to work for a business which has been all over the media for, I don't know, slavery, child labor, or maybe not treating seriously security of their employees. So all of these things actually help us to deliver on the benefits of trust. Now, I appreciate that when we're talking about it here, it sounds, well, it's wonderful, it's swell, but how do I actually go to my board? How do I deliver on this messaging? Because if there are no numbers to it, my board will not listen to this nice and optimistic chat about how people are more likely to work for ethical companies. So let me share with you a few dividends of trust which are more specific and more numbers driven. This report is actually by Edelman Trust Barometer, and it's a special report coming from brand trust in 2020 and 2021. And as you can see, trust has clear capital impact as well. You see that people are 7 times more willing to pay a premium and also 7 times more willing to share data if the company is trusted by them. They are 6 times more loyal and 5 times more likely to advocate for the company and to actually recommend the company to their peers. There's actually 80% more willingness to buy new products from a company that they trust. And they're 30 times more likely to forgive errors to such company, which, yes, we like that, especially as security people, we know that errors might happen, so this is really good. They have also 25% higher CAGR, and they're more willing to trust the affiliates of the company. So if you're looking at loyalty programs or partnership programs, this is a very important metric. If I trust someone, I'm likely to buy things and services from their affiliates. So one element that I wanted to point out here is we have learned that trust is beneficial, that it brings more money. But why are we, as security people, supposed to be worried about trust? Why isn't it somebody else's business? And my argument would be that soon there will be that somebody else coming in, and either it is us as people who are CISOs or in security roles who can help and start and frame the discussion based on the objectives that we understand, or it's likely that the business will appoint somebody who will do it for us and we'll have to start the discussion all over again, but not from our standpoint, not on our terms. So these statistics, these IDC predictions show that by the next year, 50% of the G2000 companies will be naming a chief trust officer. So this is very real, and for us from security perspective, we could become that trust officer. Very often, the businesses that name the chief trust officer, they don't bring in somebody completely from the outside, but they choose to elevate the people who are within those relevant roles. So if you are already in security, it's possible for you to elevate yourself into that role. Also, by 2025, 2/3 of the G2000 boards will ask for a specific formal trust initiative and a roadmap for businesses to achieve trust. So the boards, as I said, they're responding to the fact that the trust indicators also indicate greater growth and stability for the organizations. So they're likely to seek trust as one of the frameworks that they want their businesses to follow. And final statistic, by 2025, 40% of Fortune 1000 companies will require their partners and their vendors to meet trust key indicators. So it's not just our internal boards pushing us for trust, but it will also be the vendor chain and the vendor market demand for trust and for us as organizations to following those frameworks. So we have established that trust is actually something that is coming for us, and we can either be part of that debate and we can help shape the debate, or we can wait for it to shape us. But when we're talking about how to implement trust, if we're on board with it, we have decided, okay, let's do the trust thing. How do I go about it? I think there's this one elephant in the room that we don't officially always address, and that's the human factor. Because if you talk about trust, well, you're bound to talk about humans. And who best to start with than the CISO, than yourselves? How do you actually embrace trust? What does trust actually mean for how you behave and how you do your tasks on the daily? Because it's one thing to define trust as this, terminologic thing, but what does it mean for you in your day-to-day job? Do you change something? How are you supposed to adapt as a CISO for this new trust ideal? So I have this schema which I find really helpful, because what it does for me and for us is that it translates trust and some of the key elements of trust, like intent, integrity, capability, results, into specific characteristics of the person who is trustworthy. So if we were to look at an example with the intent, for example, we have these translated into the person being transparent, being open, and being caring. So for example, if we were to use a real-life scenario, you are dealing with a data breach. And as a CISO, you are on the front line for deciding how much information is being shared, how transparent you are as a business externally. Obviously, you have other stakeholders like marketing, PR, legal weighing in. But you are basically the person deciding, okay, how much are we going to share? You're also there able to be accountable and authentic around how do we actually communicate this internally? How do we set up the rules for how our division, the security division, interacts with vendors? Are we consistent? Are we demonstrating our skills? All of those things can actually translate into specific tangible adaptations on your side as well as on your individual team member's side. So one more element to point out here is that, as we've spoken about, that you yourselves as CISOs, as senior security individuals, are already there as part of the debate of trust. So you might actually find yourself more in center of it than you would have expected. And one of the elements that we have seen popping up more and more often in terms of relationship between CISOs and trust is the fact that you are typically the people who are partnering with external entities and vendors. So you would be like the key ambassadors for trust within your organization for that vendor and vice versa. Likewise, you are also probably knowingly or unknowingly promoting trusted employee behavior and facilitating transparency around employee behavior. So already there are quite a few elements regarding, for example, monitoring employees or the fact that you're preventing rogue employees that you're already taking on, which have a very strong impact into the trust of your company internally as well as externally. So having covered that, yes, as CISOs, as security teams, we have a lot to do with trust, and we can actually start with ourselves. How do we go operationally, practically, about implementing trust as a business? Where do we start when we want to actually move from just ourselves towards objectively moving the needle on trust? And I would actually encourage you to start by an exercise. So this is an exercise that we've had several of our customers undertake. And the rules of the exercise are to help you understand what is your business's stance on trust. What are the trust priorities as your business, as your executive board, board of directors actually see trust? And the exercise works this way. You have 100 points. You give these 100 points to everyone in your executive board. Each member of the executive board gets 100 points. And then these people have to allocate these points across operational domains. For example, we have a couple of here listed. It could be product quality, it could be customer experience, it could be financial integrity and health, ethics, culture and purpose, compliance. For example, it could be market experience. Obviously, it would definitely include cyber. It would include ESG, diversity, digital engagement, all of these. And the goal is that they need to allocate those 100 points across all of these domains, making sure that each one of them receives at least 1 point. And if you get the results from it, it will tell you how much they prioritize trust as sitting with one of these domains and which ones become more of a focal points. As you can see, this is actually a real-life example of how Deloitte has done this exercise with a real-life company. And those leaders, it's really small, so I'll read it for you. The leaders in this would be customer experience as being really important for trust, obviously. If you're being mean to your customers and supporting them, they're probably not going to trust you. Similar would be product quality or financial integrity. But if you look at the results of the trust domains, you can see something very, very concerning. The cyber, the crime, fraud, and abuse, they're the last two. So the businesses, the boards, the executives, they don't actually believe that security is contributing to trust. And this is scary for a few reasons. First of them is, as we've shown from the headlines, that if you don't have a trusted business that protects the data, you're in trouble, because if there is a breach, if there is an issue with security, well, guess what? You lose trust. The second thing is that even though it might not be as labeled as trust, it is very likely that the budget discussions for a business would be based around this logic as well. Because if businesses emphasize something as important in trust, it typically ends up meaning that they allocate more budget resources into that area as well. So for us, the important lesson here is to make sure that as we are starting our discussion on trust, we also want to make sure that we shape the discussion in a way where security and cyber actually receive more recognition as the leaders in building trust. And through that recognition, we can also get more resources as a way. So if we were to look at the next step in operationalizing trust in your business, let's say that you've done this exercise, you understand what is the starting point for your business with trust understanding and the relationship between cyber and trust and security and trust. The second step is, okay, so what can we do as a gap analysis in terms of comparing what we're already doing in our day-to-day projects as part of the CISO tasks and security team tasks, and how do these projects and initiatives relate to trust? Are they relevant for trust in any way, or are they not actually that connected to it? So in here I have a sample scorecard where we're basically tracking the key objective, which is building trust, and we have been covering this through the lens of one particular stakeholder group for trust, which is our employees. You can start with your own security team employees, and we've actually had a couple of customers go on that way. Further, you have for reference point the components of trust, the character traits that we've discussed earlier, all of those elements that humans should have on your team to be trusted. And then we break down specific operational elements of trust. So those would be the projects that we might be taking on and the key activities within these projects, and we assess whether they are actually relevant for those trust objectives. So in here, we were taking a look at IT and security risk management. And we have decided that quite a few elements are actually relevant for trust. As you can see, they're marked by different colors. So if it's red, it means yes, very relevant for trust. If it's green, it's not so much. If it's yellow, it's somewhere in between. So for example, incident response and certifications, those are the elements which are really important for businesses in building trust and which are in the realm of IT security risk management. And by extension, they are in the realm of something that we can do something about. We can actually prioritize them. We can actually think about how they paint the picture of us as being a trusted business. For example, through the fact that we have maintained and achieved further certifications on security, or through the fact that we respond transparently and effectively, transparently and effectively to incidents that we experience. So after we've done some of these examples, I wanted to also showcase a few projects which are more, I guess, spearheading trust, and where you can definitely pin down that there is a lot of overlap between security work as well as other teams' work. So for example, we have ethical and responsible AI, we have trust in biometrics, we have zero trust architecture. Those projects are going to be in the red line because they will be very important for building trust. And for them, it is even more important for us to do the exercise of analyzing what are the actual objectives and risks that we need to track from security perspective, as also risks which are relevant to company losing trust. Now, if I were to actually think about how do we manage trust, how do we actually go day by day managing specific trust elements based on how they're relevant for our business and based on them actually sitting within the realm of what we can do as security people. I would probably start by operationalizing it under a very, I guess, very familiar method. I think we have all heard about the SMART approach. So if we were to apply the SMART technique towards tracking trust, I would start by identifying the objective. And that is obviously the bigger one is the company needs to be trusted. But what does it actually translate into for your executive team? Does it mean that they want to be trusted by customers and generate more revenue? Does it mean that they want to earn more vendors which are trusted? It could mean a lot of things. It could mean that they would be all over the media as really trusted company and have marketing campaigns around this. We want to be able to pin down those specific initiatives because based on them being objectives, we can start tracking risks for them. And we can start tracking controls for them. So that's the first step. We need to be able to pin down these objectives and be very specific about them. Then comes the measurable piece. And I think this is the one which everybody fears because they have to be a little bit more specific. They have to quantify some key risk indicators. And it really boils down to what you prefer, if you want to have them sort of on and off, or if you want to have more of a scale. But it's really important to be able to measure and track what are the specific risks and how do they stack up one against another. Achievability is really the idea about maybe we want to be very specific about who do we assign those risks. Because I think every one of us, like we have been doing, well, not I as much, but we have been doing a lot of risk management. And I think the biggest pain point really is that we assign risks to the people who are not really in control of them. So very often you end up in a situation where you have a risk related to, I don't know, marketing team using an application and they have 5 licenses but 10 people to use the application. So what happens? Well, they end up sharing the passwords, obviously. But who do you actually put in ownership of that risk? Is it going to be the marketing person who purchases the license but who doesn't actually have the budget for purchasing more of it? Or is it going to be escalated to their managers who are actually, or the, I don't know, CFOs who are actually in control of these budgets? So it's worth having that kind of exercise and thought process to make sure that if we are assigning risks, we're doing it in an intentional way where the people actually understand why they're being assigned those risks and why these are actually important to be working on. Now, if we're looking at relevancy, I think the key element here is to make sure that we can measure what matters. And I think one of the elements where I seem to be having fun discussions with the security teams as a privacy person is that we're like, privacy people usually come into the discussion and they're like, we don't want the data. Any kind of data means trouble. Whereas the security people are like, if we get more data, we can measure more. And I think there is definitely like a sweet medium spot to be hit. So sometimes I feel like we're holding on to metrics which are not really all that relevant for us. So if we look at, you know, the objectives, the SPs, what we actually want to be measuring for, it usually helps us to cut down on a lot of the metrics noise. And then the time-bound thing. So making sure that we actually have realistic deadlines for when we want to achieve specific trust objectives. I mean, it's nice to say that we want to be a trusted company by the end of this year, but how do we actually go about it while understanding those specific risks and objectives? So that would be the key stakeholder items for us to look at. And if we were to break it down into some of the specific items, for example, the measurability, I think those are the elements where we can actually break it into some of the parts where the software can actually help and automation can be leveraged. So I think the one element that we want to avoid is risk subjectivity, and it goes along with the fact-based analysis. I think one of the elements where we're often very much erring is making the risks very specific, individual focus without actually having any data and facts behind them. I think one more element to point out is also the fact that the risks need to be explainable and easily reportable, because if you don't have clearly explained risks, the management and the execs are probably not going to talk to you about them anyways. So the idea behind having specific, properly justified reports on your risks, which are specifically tying to those objectives that the execs told you about for trust, this will mean that any controls and any priorities and projects tied into those controls for the trust objectives will probably get much more attention and will be easily managed. So this is actually a slide that we took from one of our customers who have actually done the exercise, and they have been able to get a little bit more out of their risk management, specifically as it relates to trust. So what they've done is basically a recap of what we spoke about. So they first looked at their business goals and OKRs. Those were the things that they actually stacked against those trust goals, and they figured out, okay, so these are our real objectives as they relate to trust and the business priorities. Second, they identified the scope. So they wanted to understand what are the objectives, scenarios, threats and opportunities, what are loss events, what are potential incidents, and how do we manage them? The third point was they didn't guess. So this is the element where they wanted to be very objective. So they were using data-driven models. They were actually understanding their audience, and they used decision tree analysis. So basically they were working around uncertainty modeling. And fourth, arguably very, very important point is they were actually using the language of the business when they were reporting on these risks and objectives. So even when we're talking about trust as something very abstract, we always want to be using the language that the board understands. So we're talking about money, we're talking about time, we're talking about reputation, we're talking about compliance and ability to operate. So for those items, as they reported on them, the last was to make sure that we trust but verify. I think we all like that at Edge. And basically what they were trying to do is set up automated evidence collection, which means that basically if I program something to do X and it does Y, the Y also triggers a report and a trigger to the right people. So that we have automated approach towards tracking a lot of these risks, and they get surfaced to the right people through more of the automation rather than more of the legwork of your team, who are then free to focus on the actual building of trust and security. So if you are wondering about maybe some further reading for this and maybe some further resources about how we technically deliver on trust in security, I would recommend for you to take a look at the IDC Trust Framework. The International Data Center have actually come up with a framework of plugging security frameworks into privacy and compliance and governance. So definitely something to consider, especially if you want to talk to your execs and board about it. I think it has a lot of good concepts. What is missing is probably some of the elements around operationalizing trust that we've just discussed in this session specifically. Now, if you are actually going to talk to your business about trust and where does security fit into it, I just wanted to point out a few good questions to initiate that debate. So asking them how does their strategy and operating model actually create the foundation for trust would be a good one. Or how do we actually build and protect customer trust in the organization? Those kinds of questions will lead them to identify some of those priority areas that they see for building trust, and those would in turn become the objectives for your process of managing trust through all of those controls and risk mitigation steps. There are a couple of other questions. I won't go through all of these, but basically we want to make sure that the board and the execs understand that there are certain events and certain priorities which help us shape what we understand as trust, and we want to be all on the same page around how these are being viewed by them. So do they think there are some specific compelling events around trust which will be relevant for the business and the sector? What these are, and once we understand them, we can operationalize them. So with that said, I will probably leave you with one last statement from my side, and that one is about trust, isn't it? So that's my favorite, I would say, definition of trust. You don't always know when you have it, but it's obvious when you don't. Okay, so with that said, I want to thank you for your attention, and if you have any questions, please feel free to share. Thank you.